Hello, welcome back to Adobe Live. My name is Joe Allen, and today we're going to be going through a crash course in Lightroom Classic for masking and maybe a few other little editing tidbits and other things. If you're new around here, we do live streams throughout the week in English, German, and French. And this particular series, the Crash Course series, is often hosted by the wonderful Tim Mubest, but I'm standing in today to give a Lightroom crash course. So, Lightroom is an application that I use most of the time as a travel photographer and constantly going around editing. I've got some photos here from a recent trip to Japan. If you know my YouTube channel, you know that I spend a lot of time in Japan and love it there. So I've got plenty of images to share. And we're just going to jump straight into it. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be editing some images and with a focus on how masking can be a benefit to the way that you edit. So think of masking as a way of selecting a certain area of an image and affecting only that particular area. And you've got plenty of tools that you can use to go about this. So you can do all sorts of different varieties. But to start with, of course, we need an image. So let's just go with this particular image. And in order to get us to a good place to start with, I'm actually just going to use a preset here, which is just going to apply some edits and adjustments. And let's go, we've got a variety of options. What do I like? What do I like? Go for something a little bit stronger. Okay, how about something like this? So this is a preset I've created that just sort of adds a little bit of contrast and a bit of strength to the image. We can see what it's doing here, so it's just affecting areas of our basic tones, some of the tone curve. I don't believe there's any color adjustments on this particular one in the curves, no. A few HSL adjustments and other things just kind of get us to a good starting point. And one thing I definitely want to do is I'm just going to adjust my verticals. So I'm actually paying attention to that left edge just to get that nice and straight, just so we can get the image to a good place and start doing our selective adjustments. Do I like the grain? Yeah, let's keep the grain. And I'm now going to crop in, and I'm enjoying a 4:3 ratio crop lately. I think it just brings in a nice sort of view of things. So I want to crop out that left edge, but I do like this down the bottom. Maybe I'm going to keep it. And let's just adjust this down. Cool. So we've got a few things to work with here, and we're now going to go and do some selective masking. So up here in the top right of your develop module, you have your masking. And this is an interface that's been redesigned in the latest version of Lightroom. So the update that came at Adobe Max of last year, there were a few different adjustments and other things. So if you're new to this, let's run through, because we've actually got some powerful features now. So there's more automatic detection of things. So we've got detection of subjects, of skies, and even backgrounds, to get the inverse of your subject. We can find objects. We can brush in, we can do some gradients on things, whether that's a straight linear one or a circular radial gradient, or we can affect just a range of the luminosity within your image. So hopefully throughout this, we'll go through a number of different options. So first of all, I'm going to start with trusty old faithful, the radial gradient. This is one that I used to use a lot, like I'd say the vast majority of my images. Back in the days when we didn't really have a huge amount of adjustments to make. So what I'm doing here is I'm just drawing a circle outward, and I'm selecting this area. So everything you see red is what we're going to be adjusting, and you can see it's red because I'm hovering over it. If we take our cursor off and start making adjustments to things, that red's gone. So the red is not going to be visible in the final image. That's just a marker to show that this is the area we're working with. And I can readjust and move around my gradient area, and I can adjust the internal area. And you see what this is doing here is it's just changing the feather of that gradient. So I can have a very small central focus to the gradient, but a large feather. So the wider it goes out to these circles, the effect is just very, very gradual. And so from the difference, you'll be able to see a harsher edge to your gradient or a much softer edge. And that's what this internal area is doing. So I'm going to position it over this taxi here. This is one of the new electric cabs that are available all over Tokyo, have been for the last 3 or 4 years now. They are going to become very iconic for sure. One thing I love about the taxis in Japan is they are so clean. They just reflect the shininess, and you can see that here. So as I'm making my adjustments, you'll notice the picture is changing slightly, and I can dramatize this. So if I just increase the exposure, you see that it's only affecting that area within our radial gradient. And you see when I'm not making any adjustments, you'll see in the masks panel here, this is where we've got our masks and our edits happening. So let's just bring that back, because we don't want to make this image utterly ridiculous, but to just showcase what you can do. I want to increase a little bit of the shadows, decrease some of the highlights, and decrease some of the contrast. And I'm just going to remove some of that harshness. So if you want to see what was happening before and after, in fact, I'm just going to zoom in so that we can definitely see this. And let's just move the image around. I can toggle this mask on and off using this eye icon over on my masks panel. So I can toggle it off, and I can see this is how the image was looking previously when I did my first preset adjustments, and this is how it's looking with that radial gradient. So anything that I do within here, and we can double click it to name, so let's just call this one taxi. So anything I do within here is going to be affected on that radial area. Cool. So what are the effects that we can do to our gradients and our masking areas? Well, we can do the basic adjustments with our tones. We can increase the exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, things like that. We've got adjustments to the white point and the black point, which can be useful if you want to maybe add some more detail to a particular part of an image. You can do that with micro adjustments to the ends of your contrast points, the lightest points and the very darkest points. We can also play around with some of the color. So if we wanted to, we could actually shift the white balance. And if I zoom back out, you see that I may just want to do a warmer spotlight on this particular part of the image. And for this image, that can actually work quite well, because this taxi is clearly within a area of sunlight. And so sometimes you may just want to dramatize that a bit, because your camera's sensor is only ever going to capture the whole scene at a particular white balance. And so depending on which you balance for, whether that's for the warmest part or the coldest part of an image, so depending on the light, that could be sunlight, or it could be tungsten light, or it could be a fluorescent tube somewhere that's illuminating the scene, you may want to adjust using a mask, because different parts of your scene will actually be balanced differently. So we can adjust our white balance here, and we can even adjust the saturation overall. So again, if I push this to the max, you'll see we can just burn in those colors. Of course, we definitely don't want to do that. And likewise, we can reduce those. And there is sometimes a time and a place where you may want to actually reduce your saturation quite heavily, and I'll try and find an image later to go through that. And some final details, we've just got some presence and some detail. So we can add in some texture on things. So from here, pay attention to the road and any sort of heavy contrast between light and dark. As I increase my texture, it just sort of brings out like a grittiness, and likewise if we remove it, it sort of smooths things out. Now of course with all of these sliders you can overdo it, and you may not want to do that, so be cautious on how far you want to push things. Because this particular radial gradient is on what is deemed to be the subject of this photo, I'm actually just going to add a tiny bit of clarity, just a little bit. And I don't need to do anything with dehaze, and sharpness again just a little bit, and that is all good. So this is our radial gradient, and if I wanted to, I can add more to these adjustments. So think of this top area, if we hover over it, and we see the red area here. Think of this top part of this layer as being the overall area. These are all of your adjustments made. This secondary part is what makes up the area. So at the moment we've got a single radial gradient, but we may want to add another one. So if we click add within here, we could add in something else. So say the brush. And I could brush in, let me zoom out, I could brush in another area that may want to have the same effects applied to it. So for argument's sake, let's say I just want to apply into this area into the underbridge, and I can just scroll to increase the size of my brush, or I can use the square brackets on my keyboard to just send those up, or I've got my controls over on the right hand side to increase my brush size and my feather, which is how harsh a brush is going to be. And if I just start brushing in, you see that I'm now painting in all of those effects that I just applied. And we've got a little bit of a flow and a density set. I could increase the flow and I could increase the density, and now it's going to apply those effects far quicker. Think of it like adding more paint to your brush. As you brush with things, if you've got more paint loaded on, you're going to slap it all over the page and you're going to get those effects. If we reduce these down, you're now going to be using a very light brush and you're only going to get tiny amounts of effects happening. So use these at your will, depending on how you want to work with them. And I'm just going to brush in. And now if we hover over our red area, let me zoom out again, and we see that that radial gradient has now taken on a different shape. And that's because we're compounding those two masks together. So we've got our brush, which is over here. And again, I can toggle that on and off, and we can see what that's adding. And then we've got our radial gradient, which was the original one we did, that's happening underneath. Or I can toggle all of it on and off, and we can see what we've done to the image overall. So what we're doing is we're just adding in some brightness, because this area in the underpass is a little bit dark, and so we can sort of brighten it up a little bit. But you notice that as I'm brightening it up, there are some parts that are maybe doing it a little bit too much. So I kind of like where it's going for the most of it. But this area is maybe just pushing it a little bit too far. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a subtract mask. And so if we go into subtract, again, I can take a brush, or I could take another one of these masks. And now we're going to detract away from our overall area. So you see how you can sort of layer things up. You can have your radial gradient as a base, you can paint in some other areas, and you can also paint, or rather erase, some areas of the overall area. So I'm now going to detract away, and because I'm getting a little bit complex with what I'm doing, I'm actually going to rename this once I've done some things. So I'm going to go back into here, and I find that I'm brightening up this area just a little bit too much for my liking. So I'm definitely going to have a big feather on this. I don't want to have a harsh effect visible. And I'm going to drop my flow and density so I do it gently. I don't want to add too much here. And so now if I just paint in a little bit, it's going to be happening very subtly. In fact, I'm going to increase that flow and density a little bit more. And now we're just reducing some of that crispness. Now this is very subtle, but this is where I was saying about the upper ends of your contrast, the very white point. And because this is clearly one of the brightest parts of the image, I'm actually just dimming these down. But I like how the overall scene, or the overall center of this image, has been lifted. So we're balancing it. We're not going too crazy on this. Yeah, we can now see what that's done. So ever so slightly, but definitely take note on this barrier here, what that subtraction has done. So that was how it was before, and now I've just subtracted. I've just reduced that harsh brightness ever so slightly. And I'm going to rename this, because brush 2 isn't very useful to me as a name. So I'm going to reduce harshness on highlights. And let's spell highlights correct. Great. So we've now got our title here. Brush 1, and again, I was close to forgetting what I did, so I'm going to rename it. And this is called Underpass Brighten. And then our radial gradient, I'm just going to call this Central Scene. So always name your masks, and you'll thank yourself in the future. definitely, because you never know when you're going to come back, and you may want to retweak an image, especially if you're preparing it for print or something else like that. Having these things labeled for you, honestly, is a pat on the back to your past self, and your future self will thank you for it. So get that into your rhythm of things. Cool. So we've done a little bit of an adjustment here. I'm actually just going to take off some of that warming aspect because it's warming up a little bit too much. You can see what we've added overall. Now let's add another mask, but this time we're going to create some new effects to it. So we don't want to compound everything together. And so we've got this button here to create a new mask. And I'm going to go for a linear gradient, which again is one of the classic styles of masking here. And I can just draw across the page or across the image, and this time we're getting a gradient from one edge at its strongest point to the other edge at its weakest point. I can reposition it, I can rotate it around, I can adjust its full width on things. And a pro tip here is you don't necessarily have to stick within the bounds of your image. So don't think that you have to send your mask right to the very edge of the frame. You can pull it all the way across so that you get full effect on a particular area, on your darkest area of your mask, or you can take it off of your image and you can get a really gradual approach. So you can make this really, really subtle. And you see that I'm angling it here. So my intention in this aspect is I'm going to draw in the light and the view from the edges of the frame and just bring those into our image. Just by darkening it ever so slightly. So I'm just going to bring down the exposure, and I'm also going to drop the contrast, because you'll find that when you bring down the exposure, what it does sometimes is it really pushes your shadows down. And when your shadows push down but the rest of the image is fairly balanced, it just looks a little overdone. Whereas if you reduce your contrast, you can maintain that detail, yet lowering the overall feeling of the image. Again, very subtle. And I'm just going to bring that down, and if we toggle this on and off, you see again it's quite subtle just on the left, and that's our framing working. And I have this set for my left side of my image, but I want the same effect to happen on the right side. So I'm going to go Add, choose Linear Gradient, and I'm going to do the same again on the right side, and you see that because we had those adjustments already applied, these are now coming into play on my image, and they will match. So the left side and the right side are going to match because both of these linear gradients are affected by this overall parent mask. So everything there is all working together and playing nice. And what do? We name our masks. So let's call this one Darken Edges. And I know what I'm doing with linear gradient 1 and 2, so I'm happy to leave those unnamed. But now we can see the effects happening there. And if I toggle the original image on and off, we can see that we're just drawing a little bit of tension into the center of the image with our effects here. Now, if you ever want to make some further adjustments to the rest of your image without affecting your masks, you'll need to come out of the masking mode. So just click it from there, and now you're back into editing your overall image. This is not localized to any particular area. And so any adjustments here, they're going to affect the whole image in general. So I'm just going to, again, tweak things just a little bit, just to my liking. And I'm actually going to cool down the overall tone of the image ever so slightly. Drop some of that contrast. Great. If we go back into our masks, now I've decided I want to add another mask to my darken edges. And this time I'm going to bring up a mask from the very bottom, and we're going to affect just the bottom edge of the image, because I noticed it was feeling a bit bright overall on that image. So we just add that in there, and we can do it ever so slightly like this. Cool. So we've got some masks happening here. And that's a bit of an introduction to how we actually go about making our masks and managing them. Let's now find a different image, and let's work on this in some other way. In fact, actually, let's take an image from the same scene, but in a different orientation, and let's paste those masks. because that can be quite useful sometimes. If you're batching a lot of images and you're editing multiple at once, you may want to take your same edits and apply them from one image over to another. So I can do Command-Shift-C, and that brings up my copy settings, or you can find it in the menu as well. And I can copy all of my adjustments that I've got made. So from our basic panel, tone curve, HSL, let's also bring in the color grading. I think I did some details, definitely did some lens correction. Let's not do the transform actually. Bring across that aspect ratio crop. And then let's also bring across our masking. And this is where it's so beneficial to name your masks, because now that I'm copying them, I know exactly what I'm bringing along. And it's not a random name that means nothing to me. So I'm going to copy these, go to my target image, and now Command-Shift-V, I can paste all of those edits, and they then apply to this new image, and we'll see that everything's there and has come across. But it's not quite right. So if we go into the masking again, first of all, I can actually rename this mask. So now I'm thinking, instead of calling it taxi, I'm going to call it vehicle, because it's no longer unique to being a taxi. And I can go in and let's choose our central scene. And you notice that because we've gone from a portrait image, or rather a vertical image, into a horizontal image, our radial gradient has rotated, which is very helpful. So now I can just readjust this into a scene area that makes sense to me. Plonk that there. Our underpass Brighton, if we hover over the brush, it maybe doesn't make sense for this particular image. And so if I turn that off, yeah, I don't think it's needed. So I can delete that. And then the reduce highlights, let's see where that's affecting. So that's definitely in the wrong place right now. But if I bring our brush, I can move it, and it's kind of in the same place that I need. I can reposition it, and that's all great. Or I can just add to it, and I can subtract in the same way previously. If we go onto our darken edges, so we've got our left one, I can just bring that, reduce it down ever so slightly, and just take off some of that harshness for that left edge of the building. Our gradient 2 comes in from the right side. Again, let's just reduce that down. And our gradient 3 was the bottom. And yeah, we definitely want to reduce some of that brightness from there. And so now we've taken the same edits from that previous image, but we've applied it into the new image. And with minimal effort, we can change things to work across multiple images, which is great. So let's toggle that on and off altogether. And in fact, I'm actually going to add another area ever so slightly, just with a brush, just to darken some of this area, because this is very, very bright, and reduce that down just a little bit. Cool. So you see how using those masks and just affecting a localized area of your image means that you can really draw attention. So at the moment, in the original, that central part is quite dark, because obviously it's in the shadows, it's, you know, hidden by or blocked by some of these buildings with the sunlight. But with some editing, we can sort of brighten it, but not make it look too artificial. Like, we can affect it in a controlled way, which is exactly what I want. All right, let's move on to another image, and let's jump somewhere. Okay, let's go for a night image. Let's go for something very different. Okay, so we've got this image here, and this is where I may use masks in a slightly different way. So once again, let's go into our develop module, and let's find a good starting point using one of my presets that I've created. And let's go for, these are a bit too strong. That could be nice. Let's go for a bit of a filmic look about things. In fact, I think I might have created this preset on a previous Adobe Live. So welcome back, old friend. And let's bring this in. Okay, so I'm just going to make some quick tweaks and adjustments to the overall scene. And one thing that I noticed with this particular image, and this is what I was talking about before, where certain parts of an image use a different white balance. So this is obviously a view of Tokyo. This is taken from the Shibuya Sky deck, and you can see different areas. In fact, the more that I'm looking at it now, I'm discovering things that are quite cool. And yeah, I mean, getting distracted now, but I love rooftop perspectives. But you can see that there are different color temperatures across the city, because of course, not everyone is managing all of the lighting, and that would be very boring if a city was, you know, all the same temperature and color. But there are definitely areas that could benefit from a few adjustments just to bring them back in line. So we've got some blown out highlights in places, and we're going to try and affect those. And these are tweaks that I do frequently on my images. So let's just get this image into a good starting point. So I like the overall brightness that's afforded to us across the majority of the scene. So we've got the train tracks here and the Shibuya crossing, the Shibuya scramble here. But of course, as we're brightening the overall scene, there are areas that are already bright, and so we're brightening them a little too much. So I kind of want to find a balance that works for me. So I'm going to go into my masks, and I'm going to do let's do a brush. I'm going to experiment with a different mask in a moment, see if we can get the same effect. So with my brush, let's just reduce the size down. I'm going to be fairly slapdash with this, so I'm going to use a pretty healthy size brush. Our flow is about halfway, yeah, that's good. And I'm just going to paint in these areas, and at the moment it's doing nothing, it's just choosing our areas that we want to work with. So I'm just going for some of the brightest parts of the overall scene, and then I'm going to tweak it just to bring down some of the brightness. Okay, so we've got these are our masking settings, our brush settings. And now I'm going to just bring down some of that exposure. If I, again, dramatize that, you can see, you know, only the areas that we're affecting. And I do this frequently, especially with night images in a city, because you do have areas that are very differing between your highlights and your shadows. And a camera can only capture so much, or rather it can only output a particular rendering of that. But if you're shooting raw, you have the flexibility of adjusting some of your shadows, raising those, and having your highlights and bringing those down. You can find your balance, and then when you use masking, you can adjust those in specific local areas. So I'm just going to bring down the highlights, and let's just see how that's looking. So you see it's applying just in these areas, and that's looking great. And I'm going to rename this one to Base Adjustments. So that had an amount of the what I would call the baseline highlights and brightness that I want to bring down. But there are some areas of here that I actually want to bring down even further, and there's two ways of going about that. I could either create a new mask, and I could bring the highlights down further, and I can adjust those accordingly, or because I was using a brush on this with a particular density, I can just add to it and I can build on top. So think about painting with a thin amount of paint on your brush, and you paint over the page. If you want to make a certain area more affected by whatever you're painting, you can just go over it again with another layer. So we're going to create a new layer, and we'll go to our brush, and keeping the density and the flow the same, I'm now just going to be painting over this area again, and you'll see that the more times I click, the more it's just adding in and adding to that density. Of course, I can also increase the flow and I can get to that result quicker, but you may overdo it in those particular instances. And so this method works better for me because I'm not getting multiple layers and multiple masks that are all kind of doing the same thing. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm using one mask that does what I want it to do, which is reduce those highlights, but I'm just building on it. And so I'm just saying this particular area is going to be more masked, and this particular area is going to be less masked. And so all of those combined mean that we can be quite efficient in the way that we balance this image out. And so now you can see that I can just reduce that, and I can just reduce some of those overly bright areas of the scene. And within our mask, and let's rename this mask to darken highlights. Great. So that's something that I do a lot with my night photography, especially in urban areas. And let's now do a little bit different. Again, let's use the brush. And you see that it becomes quite powerful, even though, simple tools, you've got plenty of flexibility. It's just about the way that you think about it. So I'm going to use the brush, and I can see that some of these areas, especially around the low street levels, they're very warm. And by warm, I mean they're quite orange. And it just comes across a little bit strong at times. So I'm just going to paint in to all of these sort of warmer areas. Now I could be a little bit more precise with this, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to be a little bit quick with it. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce down those highlights ever so slightly. And of course, when you push it more towards the blue of things, you start to get a bit of a green shift happening at times. That's not really something I want. So I'm going to be careful not to overdo it if I go all the way blue. Likewise, I could go all the way orange and warm it up even further. So I'm just going to cool it down a little bit, but I can also adjust the tint. So I can just affect how that adjusts on the color wheel, and everything that's happening when you push one way, you affect colors another way, so you have to tint it and sort of mold it back into place. So I'm actually just going to add some of that magenta back, just a tiny amount. And then I'm also going to desaturate an area. Because these are strong lights, and the strength of the light means it's going to get exposed more on your camera's sensor, it's also bringing with it a lot of saturation. And so I want to bring that back a little bit, and maybe just adjust the highlights down just a tiny, tiny amount. And so now, if I toggle this on and off, I mean, that's very subtle, very, very subtle, but it will have an effect, especially when you share this as a print, because some areas that are oversaturated, you can just tell it gets absorbed so much by the paper. And we don't want too much shift there, but it's going to do these effects. And cool. So let's go back to the original, which was looking like this. And then our adjustments, which were bringing in some of that filmic style from the original preset that I worked with. And now let's close our masking. And now that we've got like a balanced approach on where we're looking with things, I can just start to make some adjustments to the overall image. And because our highlights have been balanced, it's not going to throw it too much out of whack on stuff. So I can make some adjustments. In fact, I could cool down the whole image. And because it was balanced, we're not throwing it around. And yeah, this is working all right. And yeah, so I'd take this image and I'd probably tinker about with it and make some further adjustments. This demonstration, of course, I'm just going through the masking capabilities, but you can see how I've removed some of those hot spots. And you know what? I found another area that I want to work on. Let's go and what can we do on this? Yeah, let's go for another brush. Good old brush. Let's just paint it. I'm just going to brighten up some of these train tracks here so that they match with this end of the station. Because this is where the platform sort of ends, and then it's pretty well illuminated. And it looks a little bit unbalanced in that area. So, what's going on here? I scrolled too far. So make sure you stay within your masking area. So let's just bring the exposure up a little bit, bring the shadows up. And if you want, you can move this window out of the way so you can see what you're working on. And let's just rename this one to Brighton Train Tracks, not to be mistaken with Brighton, the city. So that's our image, and those are some of the basic masking effects. But Adobe now has some smarter effects that you can work with. And these work great on images of people and subjects. So I've got this image here of myself that I would probably use for maybe a thumbnail for one of my videos or something. And there's a few effects and adjustments that I'd want to make. So again, let's just get to a good starting point. Let's not be, too hasty on this. Let's just get edit to a good point. Make sure we're all good. And looking great. Cool. And now let's do some adjustments just on me, the subject. So you see we've got the option here for subject, but we've also got down here people. And Adobe Sensei has now found a person within the image, which is me. So person 1, nice to meet you. And it's detected me and removed the camera, and also removed some of this equipment that's on my camera bag. So it's done a pretty good job, and especially if we zoom in, especially on areas of the hairline into the background. So if I select this, it's now going to break down that selection and give me some further control on things. So we can actually choose what part of our selection, the automatic person selection, do we want to work with. So do we want to create a mask for the entire person? Do we want to do just the face skin? Because maybe you want to do some adjustments that just tweak some parts of your image in that way. Or maybe your body skin, which would be anywhere from the face below that's visible. So in this case, my neck, my hands. Maybe I want to grow out my eyebrows and just select those and make some adjustments. Or adjust the iris and the pupils, and you can see the granular detail that we got here, which is brilliant. So I'm just going for entire person to start with, and then hit create mask. And I'm going to bring my mask panel back to where it was originally. And now, much the same that we were doing previously, I can make my adjustments, and just to show the extreme of it, I've got all of this. And so from here, I can very quickly make some fine-tune adjustments, and I can start to work with my image in this way. So you can think of the possibilities that you've got for your editing, and you can do your adjustments like this. But there's one really powerful feature that you have. And so rather than thinking of what areas do you want to edit and adjust, but rather think of it the inverse of what areas don't you want to adjust. So I've got my mask here, which is me as the person, and any adjustments here that I was making were brightening me up and adding it. But I always have the option to invert that mask. And so if I invert it, now my adjustments affect everything but me. And so I can use this to very quickly make changes to my environment. So let's say I actually want to reduce some of that contrast behind, and maybe I want to darken it down. And it's not so much that I want to brighten me up, because I actually quite like the light that's falling on my face. I just want to draw more attention to it by darkening the background. And likewise, the sky is quite blue, and it's given a bit of a color cast over here. Could be a little bit too much. So I may want to just desaturate that back a little bit. And now we can see that our effects are taking shape in the inverse. So if we hover over our mask, it's affecting everywhere but the primary subject, which is brilliant. But we may not want to go too far on it. And so a further detail that you've got with all of your masks that you create is when you have them selected as the top option here. And let me just rename that actually to me. We've always got the option to adjust your effect, and you can bring it back and you can make your changes like this, or you can over dramatically do it if you really want to, but we don't need to do that. And so that is how we would piece together all of the masking functionality and our tools at our disposal. We didn't go into the full detail of individual subjects and other things, because I'm sure you can assume how they work. They are exactly the same in that granular detail of finding your subject, your people, and other things. And now the control and the benefit is over to you of what part of your image do you want to edit and how do you want to piece it together. Yeah, local adjustments. They are so fundamentally important and incredibly powerful. I use them all the time in Lightroom, and it's great to see that they're consistently getting attention and being improved. Yeah, so that is your crash course into masking in Lightroom Classic. I hope that's of use to you. If you've got any suggestions, or maybe you're watching this on replay, you can go and leave them in the comments. And yeah, we always want to know what areas of particular applications you want to go into further. And we'll see you live on Behance again some other time. So thanks for watching, everyone. See you later.